Welcome to Vault of Words, a place where centuries of human thought are opened through the voice of AI. Tonight we open another page and step quietly into the mind behind it. Ego doesn't shout. It whispers. It doesn't announce itself as arrogance or pride. It hides behind good intentions, behind ambition, behind the quiet need to be seen. You can spend your whole life chasing meaning, unaware that the very voice guiding you forward is the same one that keeps you trapped. Ego is the silent architect of chaos, the voice that says you deserve more, you're right, you've been wronged. It builds illusions of importance that crumble the moment you stop feeding them. And yet ego isn't evil, it's frightened. It's the part of you that wants to be enough, but doesn't know how without applause. True strength begins the moment you stop defending this fragile self-image and start listening to the stillness beneath it. Because in every battle you win through pride, you lose something deeper, the peace that comes only from humility. Ego is not something we are born with. It's something we build. It starts small. A child reaching for attention, for praise, for proof that they exist. The first time someone says, "Good job," something shifts. A connection forms between love and performance, between being and approval. It's innocent at first. You learn that being noticed feels safe, that being unseen feels like disappearing. So you start performing, a little louder, a little brighter, a little more often. That's how the seed is planted. As you grow, the world waters that seed constantly. School teaches you to compete. Society teaches you to compare. Success becomes measured not by fulfillment, but by visibility. How many people see you, follow you, admire you? You're told to stand out, to be special, to be remembered. But no one explains the cost of chasing exceptionalism, the quiet death of peace. Ego begins to weave itself through every aspect of your identity, like a shadow that grows larger the more you try to stand in the light. At its core, ego is not confidence. It's insecurity, dressed as importance. It's the internal storyteller that constantly reinterprets reality to protect your image. When someone criticizes you, ego translates it as threat. When someone succeeds, ego calls it competition. It narrates your life as a movie, where you must always be the hero, the victim, or the misunderstood genius. Anything but ordinary, because to the ego, being ordinary feels like erasure. You learn to protect this self-image, like it's sacred. You defend your opinions, even when you no longer believe them. You cling to your past achievements, as if they guarantee your worth. You rehearse conversations, reimagine arguments, rewrite history in your favor, all to maintain the illusion of control. But ego's control is fragile. It depends entirely on how others see you. The moment someone stops clapping, the moment you fail, it begins to fracture. That's when fear appears, not of failure itself, but of being no one. It's easy to see ego in others, the loud, the boastful, the self-centered. But in truth, ego thrives most comfortably in subtlety. It lives in the person who can't stop helping others because they need to be seen as selfless. It hides in the teacher who must always be right, the artist who must always be original, the friend who can't admit hurt. It whispers that your worth depends on how necessary you are, how irreplaceable you appear. And the moment you believe it, you start performing life instead of living it. Humility isn't the absence of ego, it's awareness of it. But before awareness comes, there's a long season of blindness, a time when the ego feels like you. You don't question it, because it sounds so much like your own thoughts. You chase goals, defend ideas, pursue admiration, all in the name of purpose. But purpose without humility becomes poison. The ego's ambition always ends the same way: burnout, resentment, or loneliness. Because ego thrives on separation, it defines itself by difference. It cannot exist without a them to be better than. Think about how many wars, literal and emotional, began with bruised egos. Relationships collapse not from lack of love, but from the refusal to apologize. Companies crumble because leaders prefer control to collaboration. History repeats because humility never made headlines. And yet, in the ruins of every failure, ego remains invisible, whispering excuses to survive. They didn't understand me. I was right. They were wrong. It deflects, denies, and defends anything but disappear. But there is a point, often quiet and painful, when you begin to see the shadow for what it is. Usually, it's born from failure. A moment when the story you've been telling yourself no longer fits the reality around you. Maybe it's a career that no longer satisfies you, a relationship you ruined trying to be right, a dream you achieved only to find it empty. The pain of those moments is not punishment, it's exposure. Life is showing you the weight you've been carrying, and who you've become beneath it. The fall of ego is always humiliating, but humiliation is just humility breaking through the surface. It's the undoing of illusion. You realize that all your striving, all your defensiveness, all your validation seeking were attempts to escape the discomfort of simply being, without achievements, without applause, without an audience. Who are you? That question terrifies the ego, but it's also the doorway to freedom. You start to see how much of your life has been lived as performance. You start to notice how often you speak to be heard, rather than to connect. How often you listen only to respond. How often your generosity is rooted in image, not compassion. It's sobering, and yet, it's the beginning of awakening. The moment you see ego as a mask, you begin to remember the face underneath. Humility doesn't destroy the ego. It dissolves its illusions. It says, you are not your achievements. You are not your failures. You are not the story they tell about you. It restores perspective, because when you no longer need to be special, you finally have the space to be real. You stop striving to be better than others, and start focusing on being better for others. You realize that confidence doesn't come from proving your worth, but from knowing you don't have to. And slowly, your shadow begins to shrink, not because the light got brighter, but because you stopped standing in the way of it. That's how ego becomes a teacher instead of an enemy. When you stop fighting it and start observing it, you see it rise when you're praised, sting when you're ignored, flare when you're criticized. But instead of letting it drive you, you nod and move on. You no longer need to win every argument or protect every image. You simply live, lighter, truer, quieter. Because the greatest freedom you'll ever know isn't found in self-importance. It's found in self-forgetfulness. The moment you no longer need to prove who you are, you finally remember who you've been all along. Humility is one of those virtues that sounds gentle but is forged in fire. It doesn't grow in comfort or certainty. It emerges in the ruins of ego after the illusions collapse, when your reflection finally stops flattering you. Humility is not weakness. It's not submission. It's not self-denial. It's power, distilled to its purest and most precise form. Strength that no longer needs to be loud. The ego craves recognition. It wants to be the center of gravity in every room, the author of every success, the victim of every failure. But humility knows something deeper, that truth exists regardless of who speaks it, and meaning survives without applause. To be humble is not to think less of yourself. It's to stop thinking of yourself so constantly. It's stepping out of the way of life and letting truth move through you instead of around you. The humble person doesn't stop acting. They act with intention. They don't stop leading. They lead without noise. They don't stop achieving. They simply detach from the story their ego wants to tell about achievement. They can celebrate quietly, lose gracefully, and listen fully, not because they lack ambition, but because they've learned to aim beyond vanity. Humility redefines victory. It teaches you that not every battle is worth winning, and not every win is worth celebrating. Sometimes the truest victory is in restraint, in refusing to defend an image that doesn't need protecting. The person who learns to lose their image finds a peace no reputation can match. There's a strength in silence, a kind of authority that doesn't need to shout. The humble person carries this silence like armor. When insulted, they don't react. When praised, they don't inflate. Their center remains unshaken because it isn't built on perception. It's built on awareness, the understanding that the world is vast, and they are just one part of it. Ego thrives on the illusion of separation. Humility thrives on connection. The ego says, I am special. Humility says, I am part of something greater. The irony is that humility often looks like invisibility, but in truth, it makes you radiant, because when you no longer need to be the focus, people start to trust you. They sense authenticity, not performance. You become the kind of presence that calms a room instead of dominating it. Humility is magnetic in a world obsessed with noise. But humility doesn't come naturally. It must be practiced like an art, through patience, reflection, and failure. Every time you pause before responding, you're strengthening it. Every time you admit, I don't know, you're feeding it. Every time you let someone else have the spotlight without shrinking, you're living it. Humility grows not in moments of triumph, but in moments of surrender, when you allow the truth to matter more than your pride. Ego collects, humility releases. Ego clings to identity, humility welcomes change. Ego competes, humility collaborates. Ego demands to be seen, humility quietly observes. And in this contrast lies the freedom that so many search for, the liberation from the exhausting performance of self. In a world built on branding and constant assertion, humility feels almost rebellious. It's the refusal to shout in a room full of noise. It's the courage to be kind in a culture that rewards outrage. It's the discipline to stay curious in a world obsessed with certainty. It's the grace to stay grounded when you finally succeed, and the resilience to stay grateful when you fail. To be humble is to understand that every moment is shared, that your success is made possible by countless invisible hands, that your knowledge is borrowed, that your existence is interwoven with others. It's realizing that you stand not above anyone, but among everyone. This understanding doesn't weaken you, it expands you. You start to see how connected everything truly is, and how small acts of humility ripple out into something vast and healing. And when you start living with humility, something paradoxical happens. You stop feeling small. You stop fearing irrelevance. You stop needing validation. The less you obsess over proving your worth, the more solid it becomes. Because confidence that comes from humility doesn't crumble under scrutiny. It deepens. It's rooted in truth, not performance. The great irony of life is that the ego promises strength, but delivers fragility, while humility promises softness, but delivers power. The humble person moves quietly through the world, but leaves an imprint far deeper than those who demand to be remembered. They know that the loudest force is not the storm, but the wind that shapes mountains over time. Humility doesn't end ego. It transforms it. It turns I deserve into I'm grateful. It turns I know into I'm learning. It turns I'm right into I understand. It takes the raw energy of ambition and refines it into wisdom. Because humility doesn't destroy desire. It purifies it. It allows you to move without needing to prove, to love without needing to own, to lead without needing to dominate. That is the power hidden in humility. Quiet, steady, unshakable. It doesn't ask for validation, because it already knows that peace is its own reward. And when humility takes root in you, ego no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a reminder, a signal to return to stillness, a whisper saying you are enough, even unseen. There is a point when every fight begins to feel the same. You argue not to understand, but to preserve something fragile inside you. You resist not because the world is wrong, but because you cannot bear to be small. That's when the quiet truth of surrender begins to whisper, not as defeat, but as awakening. The ego calls surrender weakness. Humility calls it wisdom. To surrender is to recognize that not every battle is meant to be won, and not every wound needs to be defended. Some things are not conquered, they are released. When you live through enough storms, you begin to notice something. The strongest trees are not the ones that never bend, but the ones that bow with the wind. Surrender is not falling apart. It's learning how to bend without breaking. It's the ability to say, I don't need to control everything to remain whole. The ego fears that softness will make you invisible. But in truth, surrender sharpens you. It removes the illusion of control and replaces it with clarity. You stop wasting strength on resistance and start using it for endurance. The strongest people you'll ever meet often look the gentlest. They don't need to prove their resilience because they've lived through the undoing of it. They know what it means to lose, to fail, to be humbled by life itself, and yet still choose kindness. That's what surrender teaches, the courage to remain open after everything in you wanted to close. You realize that life isn't something to win, it's something to meet, moment by moment without armor. The ego thrives on reaction. It cannot exist without opposition. But surrender removes the audience. It stops feeding the cycle of conflict. When you no longer need to be right, the argument ends. When you no longer need to impress, the comparison dissolves. You stop responding from fear and start responding from understanding. You realize that strength isn't loud. It's silent, steady, rooted in acceptance. Surrender does not mean submission. It means partnership with reality. You stop fighting what is. You start moving with it instead of against it. When you let go of your need to dominate the moment, you begin to move with life's rhythm instead of tripping over it. There's a grace in this kind of living, the kind that can't be taught, only discovered through humility. Humility turns loss into learning. Every time you fail and don't collapse, you become less dependent on outcome. Every time you let someone else's misunderstanding pass without defense, you become freer from ego's prison. Every time you admit uncertainty, you loosen the grip of pride. Slowly, you begin to see that surrender is not a single act, but a lifelong conversation between what you want and what the world offers. It's easy to mistake surrender for giving up, but giving up comes from despair. Surrender comes from wisdom. Giving up says, I have no power. Surrender says, I no longer need to control. One is a collapse, the other is an awakening. The person who has learned to surrender walks differently, lighter, calmer, unhurried. They still have goals, but those goals no longer define their worth. They still love deeply, but without the need to possess. They still fight for what matters, but they know when to stop swinging. There's an incredible power in being able to let go in the middle of chaos. To say this moment does not need to go my way for it to be okay. That's when strength becomes serenity. You stop demanding perfection and start allowing imperfection to teach you. You realize that the world does not owe you understanding, and yet somehow you understand it more. Ego resists surrender because it thrives on the illusion of separation. The idea that life is happening to you instead of through you. But humility dissolves that barrier. It reminds you that you are not standing apart from life, observing it. You are part of it. You are not a conqueror in this world. You are a participant. And in participation, surrender becomes sacred. You begin to see the beauty in not having the last word. You start finding satisfaction in moments where you once needed control. You let others lead sometimes, not out of weakness, but out of peace. The ego keeps score. Humility lets the score fade. It's not that you stop caring, you just stop competing. And somewhere in that silence, you feel a new kind of strength, one that doesn't need armor, you realize that surrender is not the opposite of victory. It's the foundation of it, because only the one who can kneel can truly rise. Only the one who can listen can truly understand. Only the one who can yield can truly move forward without resistance. To surrender is to say, I trust life more than I trust my fear. And that simple act of trust changes everything. It transforms anxiety into acceptance, pride into patience, control into compassion. It allows you to walk through uncertainty without panic, to face loss without collapse, to exist without needing to constantly prove you deserve to. In the end, surrender is not a fall. It's a flight disguised as one. When you let go of control, you don't fall into nothingness. You fall into life itself. You discover that the peace you were chasing was never ahead of you. It was beneath you all along, waiting for you to stop fighting gravity. That is when surrender becomes strength. When you realize that the softer you are, the more unbreakable you become. There's a strange freedom in realizing you don't have to be remarkable. The world keeps telling you to be louder, faster, more visible, to brand yourself, to sell your story, to make sure everyone knows your name. But in that endless performance, something sacred is lost. The quiet joy of anonymity, the peace of not needing to prove your value, the grace of simply existing without explanation. In a culture addicted to self-display, humility becomes rebellion, and smallness becomes art. To be small in a loud world is not to vanish. It's to choose depth over distance. The loud chase attention. The humble seek understanding. Noise demands to be heard, but silence invites reflection. When you stop needing to occupy every space, you begin to notice the spaces that matter, the ones within you, between you, and around you. You start to see that true influence doesn't come from being seen, but from being felt. The ego hates this lesson because it thrives on recognition. It wants evidence that it matters. Likes, followers, applause, metrics. But the soul measures differently. It doesn't count impressions. It leaves them quietly. You begin to understand that the most powerful presences in history often moved in silence. Thinkers who shaped civilizations but died unknown. Artists who painted not for fame, but for meaning. Saints who served without a single witness. Their power wasn't in being celebrated, it was in being sincere. Humility teaches you that impact isn't always visible. A kind word can outlast a monument. A single honest act can echo longer than a lifetime of performances. The ego believes that greatness must be recognized to be real. Humility knows that truth doesn't need witnesses to exist. The quiet person who listens deeply may heal more than the loud one who lectures endlessly. The one who shows up consistently, unseen, unpraised, builds the foundation others stand on. The art of being small is not about retreating from the world, but about no longer letting the world dictate your worth. You don't shrink yourself out of fear. You step back out of understanding. You stop chasing validation because you've seen what it costs. The exhaustion of constant relevance. You stop performing productivity and start practicing presence. Life becomes less about legacy and more about honesty. In the stillness of humility, you rediscover wonder. You realize how vast the world is, how intricate the details are that ego never lets you see. A child laughing, a stranger's kindness, the rhythm of your own breathing. These small things begin to feel enormous once you stop standing in your own way. To be small is to be receptive, to let life pour into you instead of trying to contain it. It takes courage to be small in a society that confuses volume with value. People will mistake your silence for uncertainty, your modesty for weakness. Let them. They don't see the discipline it takes to hold your tongue when your ego wants to speak. They don't understand the strength required to stay calm when you could prove yourself right. They don't realize that stillness is not absence, it's mastery. Smallness doesn't mean you lack confidence. It means you've transcended the need for performance. You still move, still create, still contribute, but you do it without shouting. You no longer burn energy on convincing the world of your worth. You live it. Every gentle act, every honest word, every quiet decision becomes proof enough. The world may not notice, but life itself does. And something miraculous happens. When you stop trying to fill every silence, you start hearing things you couldn't before. The subtle rhythm of your own intuition, the soft guidance of wisdom that only speaks when you're quiet enough to listen. You realize that humility isn't a costume you wear. It's a frequency you tune into. It allows you to move through chaos without absorbing it, to exist among noise without losing your tone. The art of being small is, at its heart, the art of peace. When you no longer need to be seen, you finally see clearly. When you no longer need to win, you begin to grow. When you no longer need to be first, you learn the beauty of waiting. Smallness isn't an absence of ambition. It's the presence of balance. It's ambition purified of ego, passion purified of pride. To be small is not to be insignificant. It's to be specific. It's to take your place in the world, not as the sun, but as a star among billions, shining quietly, adding light without demand. You don't have to dominate the sky to matter. You just have to shine sincerely in your corner of it. Because in the end, loudness fades, fame forgets, attention shifts. But the quiet things, truth, kindness, humility, they endure. They echo softly through time, carried by those who were too busy living meaningfully to notice they were being profound. That's the beauty of being small in a loud world. You don't disappear. You simply stop shouting long enough to hear the heartbeat of life itself. In the end, every journey of ego leads to the same quiet revelation. There was never an enemy outside of you. The only battle worth fighting has always been within, between the part of you that needs to control and the part that longs to be free. Ego was never evil. It was simply afraid of being unseen, unheard, unloved. It built walls of pride to protect itself, but those walls became its cage. You spend so many years strengthening those walls, collecting achievements, building identities, proving worth, until one day you realize you can't breathe inside them anymore. That's when humility arrives, not as a teacher with answers, but as an open door. Humility asks you to step outside of your fortress. It doesn't strip you of who you are. It reminds you of what you've always been beneath the noise. It teaches you that value isn't earned through applause or attention. It's expressed through awareness. The victory of the self that lets go is the victory of perspective. You begin to see that you never needed to be better than anyone else. You just needed to become lighter than your own expectations. When you stop chasing recognition, you start finding meaning. You realize that the moments that made you feel most alive were never the ones where you were praised, but the ones where you were present. When you stopped talking long enough to truly listen, when you helped without needing credit, when you forgave without an audience, those are the quiet victories that shape a soul. They don't trend, they transform. The paradox of humility is that it gives you everything ego promised, but in a way you never expected. Ego promised confidence. Humility delivers peace. Ego promised success. Humility delivers purpose. Ego promised importance. Humility delivers connection. What you lose in visibility, you gain in clarity. What you surrender in pride, you reclaim in freedom. Letting go doesn't mean becoming less ambitious. It means becoming more precise with your ambitions. You no longer climb every mountain just to prove you can. You start asking which ones are worth the climb at all. You measure success not by how high you rise, but by how gently you move through life. You start valuing calm more than control, honesty more than image, substance more than noise. The self that lets go is not passive. It's powerful in a different way. It leads by presence, not pressure. It influences by example, not insistence. It walks into rooms and changes the energy without saying a word. There's no hunger for validation, because validation has been replaced with understanding, the quiet knowing that you are enough, even when no one sees it. Humility frees you from the exhausting need to maintain the illusion of perfection. It gives you permission to be flawed, to fail, to apologize, to grow. It lets you exist as a human being rather than a brand. You start to find beauty in imperfection, in the cracks of your own story, in the uncertainties that make life unpredictable. You realize that humility doesn't erase you, it completes you. It allows your true self to breathe for the first time. As you walk lighter, something extraordinary happens. The world begins to soften with you. People respond differently. Conversations deepen, conflicts fade faster. Because when one person chooses humility, it disarms the entire room. The power dynamic changes, not through dominance, but through peace. You realize that strength doesn't come from standing above others. It comes from standing beside them, without needing to compete. Ego always sought victory through separation. Humility finds it through connection. The ego's victory is fleeting, applause today, silence tomorrow. But humility's victory endures, because it's not built on recognition, but on resonance. You stop trying to be the voice that speaks the loudest, and start becoming the presence that lingers the longest. And that's when you see it, the quiet truth, hiding in plain sight. The opposite of ego isn't emptiness, it's authenticity, the absence of pretense, the presence of peace, the ability to move through the world without performing, without defending, without needing to win. That's what it means to truly live. In the stillness of humility, you finally find strength that doesn't shake when tested. You can be wrong without collapsing, unseen without disappearing, forgotten without losing meaning, because your worth no longer depends on memory. It depends on being. You begin to understand that letting go is not the end of the identity, but the beginning of integrity. So when the ego whispers again, as it always will, let it. Smile at its panic, acknowledge its fear, and then gently remind it that it doesn't need to fight anymore. There's no one left to impress. There's only life left to live. And that's the final victory. Not the victory of dominance or pride, but the quiet triumph of awareness. The moment you stop needing to be someone and finally start being yourself. The moment you stop trying to conquer the world and instead learn to walk through it, humbly, lightly, fully awake. That is how humility wins every battle, by refusing to fight at all.